most perfect being ever created, looks in the mirror and whispers, "I deserve better." His name was Lucifer, the morning star, the light bearer. But behind that radiant smile was a heart yearning for something deeper, a sense of purpose beyond the divine decree. Why should I kneel when I could rule? And this is the story of how heaven's most beloved son became its greatest enemy. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, have you felt like rebelling against what was expected of you? Did you do it? Do you regret it? In the beginning, there was only perfection. Lucifer wasn't always the infamous fallen angel. Once, he was the life of the heavenly party, dazzling everyone with his charm and brilliance. Was it pride? Was it destiny? First cry for freedom in a perfect but rigid universe? But it wasn't always this way. Before the creation of time and space, heaven existed as the first and highest realm of reality. This was not a place of clouds and harps, but a vast cosmic kingdom organized in strict hierarchical order. At its center stood the throne of God, the source of all power and authority in creation. The inhabitants of this realm were the angels, immortal beings created by God to serve specific functions in the divine administration. They were organized into ranks and orders, each with designated roles and responsibilities. These beings possessed intelligence far beyond human comprehension, along with supernatural abilities suited to their divine purposes. Lucifer's creation was unlike anything that had come before or would come after. According to the ancient accounts, God formed him directly from the divine essence, making him the first and greatest of all created beings. The text described this process as deliberate and purposeful. Lucifer was not created as an afterthought, but as the centerpiece of heaven's hierarchy. The name Lucifer carries significant meaning. In the original Hebrew, it translates to shining one or day star. This was not merely a title, but a description of his fundamental nature. He was designed to be a bearer and reflector of God's own light, serving as a conduit through which divine illumination would reach all corners of creation. His physical form was extraordinary. The prophetic writings describe him as being covered with precious stones, various topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle. These were not decorative elements, but integral parts of his being, each stone contributing to his ability to reflect and amplify divine light. Gold workmanship was prepared in him, indicating the meticulous care that went into his creation. Lucifer was also endowed with musical abilities beyond comprehension. The texts mention that the workmanship of his pipes and tambourines was created within him on the day he was made. This suggests he was designed to be heaven's worship leader, with musical capability built into his very essence. When Lucifer lifted his voice in praise, it was said that all of heaven resonated in perfect harmony. His position in heaven's hierarchy was unparalleled. He was given access to God's holy mountain and was permitted to walk among the stones of fire, areas of heaven that were restricted to all other created beings. This proximity to the divine throne granted him knowledge and authority that no other angel possessed. The historical record emphasizes that Lucifer was perfect in all his ways from the moment of his creation. There was no flaw in his design, no weakness in his character, no limitation in his abilities. He embodied everything that God intended for the highest of created beings. This perfection extended to his role and function. As the anointed cherub that covers, Lucifer served as a protector and guardian of God's holiness. His position required absolute loyalty, perfect wisdom, and unwavering devotion to the divine will. For an extended period, he fulfilled these requirements without question or failure. The other angels looked to Lucifer as their example and leader. His words carried divine authority. His actions set the standard for heavenly conduct, and his presence brought assurance that all was well in the cosmic order. He was not merely respected, he was revered as the perfect embodiment of what it meant to serve God. Yet within this perfection lay the seeds of what was to come. To understand the magnitude of Lucifer's eventual rebellion, one must first grasp the extraordinary nature of his position in heaven's government. Lucifer was not simply another angel among many Kharid. He functioned as God's chief administrator, the primary intermediary between the divine throne and the rest of creation. His daily responsibilities were vast and critical. Each morning, if such temporal concepts can be applied to eternity, Lucifer would receive direct instructions from the throne. These weren't simple tasks, but complex divine mandates that required his unique combination of wisdom, power, and understanding. He would then coordinate the implementation of God's will across all heavenly realms, directing millions of angels in their various duties. When God desired to communicate with the angelic host, it was Lucifer who carried these messages. When new areas of creation required divine light, Lucifer was the one who bore that illumination to its destination. When complex cosmic operations needed oversight, Lucifer provided the leadership and expertise necessary for their completion. His influence extended beyond mere administration. Lucifer served as heaven's chief worship leader, conducting the eternal songs of praise that rose continuously before God's throne. The scale of this responsibility cannot be overstated. He directed choirs containing millions of voices, each perfectly harmonized under his guidance. The music of heaven, with all its power to maintain cosmic order and reflect divine glory, flowed through Lucifer's direction. Other high-ranking angels like Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael held positions of significant authority, but even they reported to Lucifer in the chain of command. Michael commanded heaven's armies. Gabriel served as God's primary messenger to creation, and Raphael oversaw healing and restoration, and yet all recognized Lucifer's supremacy in the heavenly hierarchy. This position granted Lucifer access to divine knowledge that others could not possess. He understood the deeper mysteries of creation, the hidden purposes behind God's actions, and the long-term plans for the universe. This knowledge made him not just a servant, but a confidant in the divine administration of all things. The trust placed in Lucifer was absolute. God had created him specifically for this role and had equipped him with everything necessary to fulfill it perfectly. There were no backup plans, no contingencies, no concerns about his reliability. The entire structure of heaven's government rested on the assumption of Lucifer's permanent faithfulness. The heaven of this era operated with precision that surpassed any earthly organization. Every angel knew their exact role, their specific responsibilities, and their place in the greater cosmic purpose. This was not a system imposed by force, but a natural order that flowed from the very nature of creation itself. At the apex sat God on his throne, the source of all authority and power. Immediately below him stood Lucifer, serving as the primary conduit for divine will. Beneath Lucifer were the various orders of angels, OSEA, seraphim, cherubim, archangels, and countless other ranks, each with their designated functions and territories of responsibility. The seraphim, with their 6 wings and continuous cries of "Holy, holy, holy," maintained the worship that surrounded God's throne. The cherubim guarded the holiness of God and served as living symbols of His glory. The archangels carried out specific divine missions and oversaw major aspects of creation. Lower orders of angels managed the day-to-day operations of the universe, maintaining physical laws, guiding natural processes, and ensuring that all things continued to function according to divine design. This system had operated flawlessly since its establishment. There had never been a rebellion, never a question of authority, never a moment of discord or dissatisfaction. Each being found complete fulfillment in their assigned role, understanding that their individual purpose contributed to a perfect whole. Communication flowed smoothly through established channels. Commands from the throne passed through Lucifer to the appropriate angelic administrators, who then implemented them with precision and enthusiasm. Reports of completed tasks flowed back up the same channels, ensuring that God remained informed of all activities throughout His realm. The harmony was not just organizational, but spiritual and emotional. Every angel felt a deep satisfaction in their service, a joy in fulfilling their created purpose, and a love for both their Creator and their fellow servants. There was no envy between the ranks, no desire for positions they had not been given, no questioning of the divine wisdom that had established their roles. Lucifer himself embodied this perfect contentment. Despite his supreme position among created beings, he showed no arrogance or sense of entitlement. He carried out his massive responsibilities with humility and gratitude, recognizing that his abilities and position were gifts from God rather than personal achievements. His leadership style reflected divine character. There is sane, firm when necessary, gentle when appropriate, and always focused on serving God's purposes rather than promoting himself. The other angels looked to him not just as their superior, but as their example of what perfect service looked like. They saw in him the ideal combination of power and humility, wisdom and obedience, glory and submission. If Lucifer, with all his gifts and privileges, could serve so faithfully, then surely they could find contentment and purpose in their own assigned roles. This was the golden age of heaven, a time when divine order functioned exactly as intended, when every being was perfectly fulfilled in their purpose, and when the very concept of rebellion was not just unthinkable, but incomprehensible. It was a system built on trust, maintained by love, and sustained by the absolute goodness of its creator. But perfection, as history would prove, could become its own burden. And within the heart of the most perfect being ever created, something was beginning to stir. The exact moment when perfection began to crack remains one of history's greatest mysteries. There was no dramatic event, no external catalyst, no obvious trigger that historians can point to and say, here is where it all began. Instead, the change in Lucifer started as something almost imperceptible, a subtle shift in perspective that would eventually reshape the entire cosmos. It began with observation. Lucifer, in his role as heaven's chief administrator, had access to every corner of the divine realm. His duties required him to oversee all angelic activities, to coordinate the endless praise that rose before God's throne, and to ensure that every aspect of heavenly operation functioned according to divine design. This comprehensive view of heaven's workings gave him a unique perspective that no other created being possessed. As he moved through his daily responsibilities, Lucifer began to notice patterns he had never consciously acknowledged before. Every morning he received his instructions from the throne, carried them out perfectly, and reported back on their completion. Every day brought the same type of tasks, every day, directing worship, administering divine commands, maintaining cosmic order. The work was meaningful, necessary, and he performed it flawlessly. But something about the routine began to feel limiting. The first question that formed in his mind was subtle. Is this all there is for me? It wasn't born from dissatisfaction with his tasks or rebellion against his role. Rather, it emerged from a growing awareness of his own capabilities and potential. Lucifer possessed wisdom that could comprehend the deepest mysteries of creation, power that could reshape reality itself, and beauty that outshone the stars. Yet all of these extraordinary gifts were channeled into a single, unchanging function: 9. Service. This question might have remained dormant indefinitely, if not for a moment of profound self-awareness. While conducting the heavenly choir in their eternal hymns of praise, Lucifer caught sight of his own reflection in one of the crystalline structures that surrounded God's throne. What he saw was a being of impossible beauty and majesty, radiating light that rivaled the divine throne itself. For the first time in his existence, he truly saw himself, not just as a servant or a creation, but as an individual entity with his own distinct nature and capabilities. The realization was startling. He had always understood himself primarily in terms of his function. He was the light bearer, the worship leader, the chief administrator. But in that moment of reflection, he began to see himself as something more people, as Lucifer, a being with his own identity that extended beyond his assigned role. This shift from functional identity to personal identity marked the beginning of everything that would follow. This new self-awareness naturally led Lucifer to observe his fellow angels with fresh eyes. What he saw both reassured and troubled him. The other angels appeared completely content with their assignments. They carried out their duties with enthusiasm and joy, showing no signs of the restlessness that had begun to stir within him. Michael, the mighty archangel who commanded heaven's armies, seemed perfectly fulfilled in his role as divine warrior. There was no ambition beyond his assignment, no desire for additional responsibilities or different functions. When given orders, he executed them with precision and returned to his post, ready for the next command. His contentment was absolute and unquestioned. Gabriel, the messenger archangel, displayed similar satisfaction. Whether carrying announcements to distant corners of creation or delivering complex divine revelations, he performed each task with equal dedication and joy. There was never a moment when Gabriel appeared to wish for a different assignment or question the importance of his role. The same pattern held true throughout heaven's hierarchy. The seraphim never tired of their continuous worship. The cherubim never questioned their role as guardians of divine holiness. The countless orders of angels below them performed their various functions with unwavering commitment and apparent happiness. This observation created a troubling paradox in Lucifer's mind. If all these angels could find complete fulfillment in their assigned roles, why was he beginning to feel constrained by his? He possessed far greater gifts, held a much more significant position, and had access to divine knowledge that others could only imagine. By all logical measures, he should be the most satisfied angel in heaven. Yet the opposite was proving true. The more he observed the contentment of others, the more aware he became of his own growing dissatisfaction. This wasn't envy of their positions. His role was clearly superior to all of theirs. Rather, it was a kind of existential loneliness, a sense that he was fundamentally different from his fellow angels in ways that went beyond rank or responsibility. This difference manifested in his capacity for what could only be called independent thought. While other angels seemed to find complete fulfillment in executing divine commands, Lucifer found himself analyzing, questioning, and extrapolating beyond the immediate task at hand. His mind naturally sought to understand not just what he was commanded to do, but why those commands were given, how they fit into larger patterns, and what alternatives might theoretically exist. The combination of increased self-awareness and the recognition of his uniqueness among the angels created what could only be described as an intellectual and spiritual stirring within Lucifer. This wasn't rebellion yet, not even close. It was more like the awakening of a deeper level of consciousness that had previously remained dormant. This stirring manifested in several ways. First, Lucifer began to experience what humans would later recognize as imagination. He found himself conceiving of alternative possibilities, different ways that heaven's operations could be organized, variations on the eternal themes of worship and service. These thoughts didn't arise from criticism of the existing order, but from the natural operation of a mind capable of extraordinary creativity. Second, he began to feel what could best be described as intellectual restlessness. The tasks that had once engaged his full attention now seemed to require only a portion of his capabilities. He could direct the heavenly choir, coordinate angelic activities, and carry out divine commands with a kind of automatic excellence that left significant portions of his consciousness unoccupied. This excess mental capacity naturally began to turn inward, examining his own nature and circumstances with increasing intensity. Third, and most significantly, he began to experience the first stirrings of what would later be recognized as ambition. This wasn't a desire to overthrow or replace God. Such a concept remained utterly foreign to his thinking. Rather, it was a growing sense that his gifts and abilities were capable of much more than his current role demanded. He began to wonder whether there might be opportunities for him to contribute to creation in ways that would more fully utilize his extraordinary capabilities. The questions that arose from this stirring were initially innocent and exploratory. What would it be like to create rather than just administer? Could I compose new forms of worship that would bring even greater glory to God? Are there realms of knowledge and power that I could explore while still maintaining my faithfulness and service? These questions created a kind of cognitive tension that Lucifer had never experienced before. On one hand, he remained completely loyal to God and satisfied with his essential purpose of bringing glory to the divine throne. On the other hand, he was increasingly aware that his gifts seemed capable of expressions that his current role didn't accommodate. This tension was manageable at first. Lucifer could acknowledge these thoughts and questions without allowing them to interfere with his duties. He continued to perform his responsibilities with the same perfection he had always displayed, while privately exploring the new landscapes of consciousness that were opening within his mind. But like a seed planted in fertile soil, this stirring began to grow. Each day brought new questions, new possibilities, new awareness of the vast potential that seemed to lie dormant within his being. The perfect contentment that had characterized his existence for eons was gradually being replaced by something far more complex, a mixture of satisfaction with his purpose and growing curiosity about what else he might become. The most dangerous aspect of this stirring was its subtlety. There were no dramatic moments of rebellion, no sudden decisions to challenge divine authority, no clear lines being crossed. Instead, there was a gradual shift in how Lucifer understood himself and his place in creation. He remained the faithful light-bearer, but he was also becoming something else, a being aware of his own individual potential and increasingly curious about the possibilities that awareness might unlock. This was still not evil, not yet corruption, not even technical disobedience. But it was the beginning of a process that would eventually transform the most perfect created being into the greatest enemy of the one who made him. The mirror's reflection had shown Lucifer not just what he was, but what he might potentially become. And once seen, that possibility could never be unseen. Lucifer had always possessed extraordinary gifts, but now those very gifts began to feel like chains. His beauty, once a source of joy as he reflected God's glory, started to seem like something that belonged to him rather than something that flowed through him. When other angels paused to watch him move through heaven's corridors, their expressions of awe no longer felt like appropriate reverence for God's workmanship. They felt like recognition of his own inherent magnificence. His wisdom presented an even greater challenge. Lucifer understood cosmic principles that other angels couldn't even perceive. He grasped the mathematical relationships governing stellar formation, the spiritual laws maintaining boundaries between realms, the complex interplay between divine will and universal order. This knowledge had always been a tool for better service, but increasingly, it felt like evidence of his exceptional nature, evidence that perhaps he was capable of more than reflecting and transmitting. The gap between his capabilities and their utilization grew more obvious each day. He possessed creative power that could theoretically reshape reality, yet his role was to reflect rather than originate. His wisdom could solve problems and design solutions, yet he was assigned to implement decisions made by others. His beauty could inspire and transform, yet it was supposed to direct attention solely toward God rather than express his own nature. This wasn't dissatisfaction with his work. The tasks remained inherently meaningful, but they had begun to feel incomplete, as though they engaged only a fraction of what he was designed to be and do. For a mind accustomed to perfect harmony between desire and reality, this experience of unfulfilled potential was profoundly disorienting. The theological implications were staggering, though Lucifer didn't initially recognize their full significance. He was beginning to question not just his role, but the wisdom of creating such magnificent capabilities only to constrain them within narrow functional boundaries. This represented the first crack in his absolute trust in God's perfect judgment and design. When these thoughts became too pressing to contain, Lucifer sought conversations with his fellow archangels. He approached Michael first, carefully framing his concerns in terms of maximizing their service to God rather than expressing personal dissatisfaction. Perhaps their individual gifts could be employed more broadly. Maybe the rigid structure of heavenly assignments limited their potential contributions to divine purposes. Michael's response was both predictable and troubling. The warrior angel expressed complete satisfaction with his assigned role and genuine confusion at Lucifer's suggestions. He found perfect fulfillment in executing God's commands. The structure of heaven reflected divine wisdom beyond their comprehension. Questioning these arrangements was itself questionable. Their purposes came from God himself, and therefore represented the optimal use of their capabilities. This conversation revealed a fundamental difference in how they processed authority. Michael found peace in submission and trust, accepting divine assignments as inherently perfect, regardless of personal understanding. Lucifer discovered that his mind naturally sought to understand, evaluate, and potentially improve the systems in which he operated. Gabriel's response proved equally illuminating but more frustrating. After listening carefully to Lucifer's concerns about underutilized potential, Gabriel offered what he clearly intended as comfort. Lucifer already held the highest position among created beings, enjoyed the closest relationship with God, and wielded more influence than any other angel. If he felt restless, perhaps the solution was finding deeper satisfaction in the magnitude of responsibilities he already carried. This response highlighted another troubling aspect. His fellow archangels interpreted his questions as temporary emotional disturbance rather than legitimate intellectual concerns. They assumed proper perspective and renewed gratitude would resolve what they saw as momentary lapse in contentment. This dismissal of his concerns as mere emotional instability rather than rational analysis further isolated him and reinforced his sense of being fundamentally different. Raphael approached the discussion from a diagnostic perspective, treating Lucifer's expressed dissatisfaction as spiritual illness requiring treatment. Perhaps prolonged proximity to divine glory had created sensory adaptation, reducing his ability to fully appreciate his circumstances. Raphael recommended periods of withdrawal from direct divine presence, increased meditation on God's goodness, and focused gratitude exercises. This medicalization of his concerns was perhaps the most disturbing response. It implied that his evolving thoughts were symptoms of malfunction rather than signs of intellectual development. The suggestion that his questions indicated spiritual illness rather than deepening understanding was both insulting and alarming. It raised the possibility that other angels were incapable of the level of thought that was becoming natural to him, or that such thinking was indeed abnormal and potentially dangerous. These conversations drove his evolving thoughts underground while confirming his sense of unique capability and perspective. If his fellow angels could not understand his concerns, if they interpreted his questions as problems to be solved rather than insights to be explored, then perhaps he was indeed operating on a level of consciousness they could not access. This isolation catalyzed something that could only be called a vision, a comprehensive reimagining of how his gifts and position could be utilized if freed from current constraints. This vision didn't emerge suddenly, but developed gradually through extended periods of contemplation and analysis. The core centered on direct creation rather than reflected glory. Lucifer began to envision himself as a source of light and beauty rather than merely a conduit for divine illumination. He imagined composing new forms of music that would surpass traditional heavenly hymns, creating new realms of beauty that would expand divine appreciation, establishing new forms of order that would demonstrate the full potential of perfect intelligence applied to cosmic organization. This creative vision naturally extended to concepts of leadership and authority. If he could envision improvements to existing systems, if he could conceive new possibilities for cosmic organization, if he possessed wisdom that his current role only partially utilized, then perhaps his capabilities qualified him for a more central role in universal governance. Not replacement of God, 99. Such concepts remained unthinkable, but elevation to a position of greater authority and creative freedom. The vision included detailed scenarios of expanded authority. He could imagine governing his own realm, perhaps a newly created dimension where his gifts could find full expression. He could see himself leading a portion of the angelic host in new forms of service that would demonstrate innovative approaches to glorifying God. He could envision creative projects of such scope and beauty that they would add entirely new dimensions to divine worship and cosmic harmony. These imaginings were seductive precisely because they seemed to represent fulfillment rather than rebellion. Lucifer wasn't envisioning opposition to God's purposes, but enhancement of them. He wasn't imagining destruction of existing order, but expansion into new realms of possibility. The vision felt not like temptation toward evil, but inspiration toward greater good. The most dangerous aspect was its apparent reasonableness. Every element seemed to flow logically from his genuine capabilities and the obvious reality that those capabilities weren't being fully utilized. The vision didn't require rejection of divine authority, merely recognition that divine wisdom might be served by allowing exceptional beings to exercise exceptional autonomy in service of divine purposes. However, embedded within this seemingly reasonable vision were assumptions that would prove catastrophic. The vision assumed his perspective was sufficiently comprehensive to evaluate divine assignments. It assumed his desires for expanded authority were motivated purely by service rather than self-interest. Most significantly, it assumed his unique gifts entitled him to unique privileges and that divine love could be demonstrated through divine accommodation to his evolving preferences. These assumptions represented clear departure from the absolute trust and submission that had characterized his relationship with God since creation. They marked transition from faithful service to conditional loyalty into 200. Loyalty dependent upon divine arrangements, meeting his evolving standards of reasonableness and optimal utilization of his gifts. The vision had formed, and with it, the seeds of doubt had found fertile ground. What remained to be seen was whether these seeds would remain dormant possibilities or develop into active challenges to the divine order that had created and sustained them. God knew everything. Every thought stirring in Lucifer's mind, every question arising in his heart, every detail of the vision forming in his consciousness, every form, all of it was perfectly visible to the Creator's omniscient awareness. Yet God's response was not immediate intervention, correction, or prevention, but something far more complex and ultimately more devastating: complete silence. This wasn't the absence of divine attention, but its most intense form. God observed every stage of Lucifer's intellectual and spiritual development with perfect knowledge of where it would lead. He witnessed the first moments of self-awareness beyond functional identity, tracked the gradual shift from contentment to restlessness, saw the formation of alternative visions for cosmic organization. Throughout this process, God remained absolutely silent, offering no correction, no guidance, no intervention. The Creator possessed perfect foreknowledge of the rebellion forming in Lucifer's heart. He understood exactly how it would unfold and knew precisely what its consequences would be for all creation. Yet he chose to allow the process to continue uninterrupted, to permit his most beloved creation to walk deliberately toward destruction without offering warning or obstacle. This divine patience wasn't indifference or uncertainty, but something far more profound: absolute respect for the free will built into the very fabric of intelligent creation. Even with his highest and most gifted creature, God would not override the fundamental liberty to choose that made true relationship and genuine love possible. Lucifer would be permitted to explore the full implications of his evolving thoughts, even unto rebellion, because the alternative, forced compliance, would negate the very nature of the love and service God desired. The silence also reflected divine sorrow of an intensity that created beings could never fully comprehend. God was watching his masterpiece, the crown jewel of creation, the being most perfectly designed to reflect divine glory, slowly poison himself with pride and ambition. Each new thought of independence, each moment of growing dissatisfaction, each element of the alternative vision forming in Lucifer's mind caused the Creator pain beyond description. Yet this pain would not interfere with Lucifer's freedom to choose his destiny. From God's perspective, this period represented the ultimate test of the principles upon which creation was designed. Could beings granted genuine freedom choose to love and serve willingly? Or would possession of such freedom inevitably lead to rebellion against their Creator? Lucifer's case would establish the precedent for this cosmic question, and God was prepared to accept whatever answer emerged, regardless of its personal cost. But from Lucifer's perspective, the divine silence created a completely different dynamic. Having grown accustomed to regular, direct communication with God through his administrative duties, the absence of any divine response to his evolving thoughts seemed profoundly significant. His interpretation of this silence was precisely opposite to its actual meaning. Rather than understanding the silence as divine sorrow and patient respect for his freedom, Lucifer interpreted it as tacit approval, or at minimum, divine indifference to his developing concerns. If God disagreed with his thoughts, surely the Creator would have communicated that disagreement. If his evolving vision was problematic, certainly God would have provided correction or guidance. The fact that no such communication occurred seemed to suggest his thoughts were not objectionable to divine sensibilities. This interpretation was reinforced by Lucifer's growing confidence in his own judgment and analytical capabilities. If his questions about divine arrangements were reasonable, if his concerns about underutilized potential were valid, if his vision for expanded authority was genuinely beneficial to cosmic purposes, then God's silence might actually represent divine recognition of these truths. Perhaps the Creator was allowing him to work through these issues independently, as a form of spiritual and intellectual development. More dangerously, Lucifer began to interpret the silence as divine acknowledgement of his unique status among created beings. If God remained silent in the face of thoughts and questions that would presumably be unacceptable from other angels, this might indicate that different standards applied to him. His exceptional gifts, his supreme position, his unparalleled access to divine knowledge might qualify him for a level of intellectual and spiritual freedom that other beings couldn't handle. This interpretation created a feedback loop that accelerated his development toward rebellion. Each period of divine silence emboldened him to explore more radical thoughts, to push further into territory that would have been clearly forbidden for lesser beings. The absence of divine correction became, in his mind, divine permission to continue his intellectual exploration wherever it might lead. Lucifer also began to reframe his entire relationship with God in light of this interpreted permission. Rather than seeing himself primarily as a servant subject to divine commands, he began to think of himself more as a junior partner in cosmic administration, a being sufficiently advanced to participate in divine decision-making rather than merely execute divine decisions made without his input. This shift from servant-master to partner relationship fundamentally altered how he understood his position and prerogatives. The silence created space for theological speculation. He began constructing theories about the nature of divine government, principles of cosmic justice, and optimal organization of universal authority. These theories, developed without divine input or correction, naturally reflected his own perspectives and preferences rather than objective truth. Yet in the absence of contrary information, they seemed increasingly valid and compelling to his exceptionally capable mind. The combination of divine silence and Lucifer's misinterpretation created conditions for what historians would later recognize as the point of no return, NET, when possibility became probability, when developing thoughts crystallized into firm intentions, when seeds of rebellion took root so deeply they became inevitable. This didn't occur as a dramatic moment of decision, but as a gradual shift in the fundamental orientation of Lucifer's consciousness. Where he had once thought in terms of what if and perhaps, he began thinking in terms of when and how. The vision that had formed in his mind was no longer theoretical possibility to be explored, but practical objective to be achieved. The point of no return was marked by Lucifer's first act of deliberate deception. He began presenting himself to other angels not as he truly was, a being struggling with growing dissatisfaction and rebellious thoughts, but as he wished to be seen, a leader confident in his authority and vision. This conscious misrepresentation of his internal state represented a fundamental breach of the honesty and transparency that had characterized all relationships in heaven since its creation. This deception was initially subtle and primarily defensive. Lucifer began concealing his questions and concerns from other angels, presenting a facade of continued contentment and loyalty while privately developing his alternative vision for cosmic organization. He learned to compartmentalize his consciousness, maintaining perfect performance in official duties while dedicating increasing mental and emotional energy to private rebellion. The deception gradually became more active and strategic. Lucifer began testing the loyalties and perspectives of other angels, carefully probing to identify those who might be sympathetic to his developing ideas. He developed techniques for planting seeds of dissatisfaction in conversations, for raising questions about divine arrangements in ways that seemed innocent but were calculated to undermine absolute trust in God's wisdom. Most significantly, he began reinterpreting his entire history and identity in light of his new understanding. Lucifer convinced himself that his exceptional gifts had always been intended for greater independence than his current role provided, that his unique position had always implied special privileges and prerogatives, and that his growing dissatisfaction represented spiritual maturity rather than dangerous rebellion. This reinterpretation extended to his understanding of divine love. Lucifer began to believe that God's love for him was demonstrated not through the gifts and position he had been given, but through divine willingness to recognize his exceptional nature and grant him appropriate autonomy. True love from this perspective would involve divine accommodation to his evolving needs and desires rather than insistence on unchanging submission to established roles. The point of no return was complete when Lucifer made a fundamental decision about the nature of divine silence. Rather than continuing to wonder about its meaning or seeking clarification through direct inquiry, he chose to interpret it definitively as divine consent to his plans. This interpretation removed the last internal obstacle to active rebellion by convincing him that his actions would not actually constitute disobedience, but rather fulfillment of divine intentions that God was too wise or too loving to state explicitly. With this decision, his identity was transformed. Lucifer was no longer a faithful servant struggling with doubts, but a rebel convinced of his own righteousness and divinely sanctioned authority to reshape cosmic order according to his own vision. The silence of God, intended as space for free choice, had been misinterpreted as endorsement for rebellion. The stage was now set for the transition from private thought to public action, from individual rebellion to cosmic revolution. What had begun as innocent questions about divine arrangements was about to become the greatest challenge to divine authority in the history of creation. And through it all, God remained silent, watching his beloved creation choose destruction while respecting the freedom that made both love and loss possible. Lucifer's first recruit was Beelzebub, a powerful cherub who served in heaven's administrative hierarchy. The choice was calculated. Beelzebub possessed significant intelligence and authority, while his position created natural opportunities for private conversation. More importantly, Lucifer had observed subtle signs of restlessness in him during their routine administrative meetings. The corruption began subtly during one of their regular planning sessions. Lucifer mentioned how complex their administrative duties had become and how challenging it was to implement divine commands across increasingly vast areas of creation. He spoke about the weight of responsibility they carried and how little recognition they received for their crucial work. These weren't lies. They were selective truths designed to resonate with existing frustrations. Over subsequent meetings, Lucifer gradually introduced more provocative concepts. He spoke of the enormous trust God had placed in them and the critical nature of their work. He wondered aloud whether they might be capable of even greater service if given expanded authority and freedom to make decisions without constant oversight. Each conversation built upon the previous one, moving incrementally toward more radical territory. The breakthrough came when Beelzebub independently echoed these thoughts. During one administrative session, he remarked that he sometimes wondered whether their current assignments fully utilized their capabilities. Perhaps there were ways to serve God's purposes more effectively with greater autonomy in decision-making. This unsolicited expression told Lucifer his careful cultivation was succeeding. The final stage involved Lucifer sharing his vision more explicitly. He spoke of expanded realms of authority, new forms of service that would bring even greater glory to God, and the potential for exceptional beings to exercise exceptional freedom in pursuit of divine purposes. He presented rebellion not as opposition to God, but as evolution of their service into more mature and effective forms. Beelzebub's acceptance marked a historic moment, the first successful corruption of a perfect being by another perfect being. The psychological dynamics established the pattern for all subsequent recruitment. Lucifer had learned to identify existing points of dissatisfaction, amplify those concerns through careful questioning, and present rebellion as the solution to legitimate spiritual and intellectual needs. With Beelzebub confirmed as an ally, Lucifer began systematic expansion of his rebellion into a movement. This required developing skills that had never existed in heaven: deception, manipulation, conspiracy, sedition. The fact that he could master these techniques so quickly demonstrated both his exceptional intelligence and the devastating potential of corrupted perfection. His recruitment strategy varied by target. For administrative angels like Beelzebub, he emphasized underutilized authority and more effective service through greater autonomy. For warrior angels, he focused on expanded military campaigns and the glory of commanding their own forces. For angels involved in creative functions, he spoke of creating new forms of beauty and expression beyond traditional patterns of heavenly worship. Each recruitment was carefully tailored and gradually developed. Lucifer never revealed his full vision initially, but drew potential recruits through increasingly radical ideas, always presented as logical extensions of previous discussions. This technique allowed him to gauge receptivity while providing plausible deniability if anyone proved unreceptive. The psychological profile of susceptible angels revealed disturbing patterns. Those with exceptional gifts often felt constrained by assigned roles. Angels with strong creative impulses were drawn to the possibility of expressing those impulses more freely. Beings with natural leadership abilities were attracted to governing their own spheres of authority. In essence, the most gifted angels were often the most vulnerable to Lucifer's arguments. This pattern created a catastrophic dynamic. As Lucifer successfully recruited more powerful and capable angels, his movement gained both credibility and influence. Lesser angels began noticing that many of the beings they most admired and respected were aligning with Lucifer's vision. This social proof made recruitment increasingly easy and self-reinforcing. The movement developed its own internal culture and communication networks. Recruited angels began identifying each other through subtle signals and coded language that allowed discussion of evolving beliefs without detection by loyal angels. They developed alternative interpretations of divine commands, theological explanations for growing dissatisfaction, and shared visions of what heaven could become under different leadership. Lucifer proved to be a charismatic and compelling leader. His natural gifts for communication, combined with intimate knowledge of heavenly operations and divine purposes, allowed him to present his vision with remarkable persuasiveness. He could address theological concerns, answer practical questions, and paint inspiring pictures of the future that made rebellion seem not only reasonable but noble. As recruitment efforts expanded, heaven began experiencing something unprecedented: systematic division among the angelic host. This division was initially subtle and hidden, but gradually became apparent as the two groups developed distinct attitudes, behaviors, and loyalties. The loyal angels began noticing disturbing changes in heaven's spiritual atmosphere. Conversations that had once featured unanimous agreement increasingly contained subtle disagreements and alternative perspectives. The perfect harmony that had defined heavenly existence was becoming fragmented by discord that seemed to have no clear source or explanation. Michael, as commander of heaven's armies, was among the first to recognize that something significant was occurring. His military training made him sensitive to changes in group dynamics and loyalty patterns. He observed that certain angels were developing what could only be described as independent agendas, pursuing objectives and holding discussions that seemed disconnected from official divine purposes. Gabriel's role as God's primary messenger gave him insight into communication patterns throughout heaven. He noticed that information flow was becoming less transparent and complete. Angels who had always shared freely with colleagues were becoming more guarded and selective. There were conversations occurring that were deliberately concealed from certain participants, creating networks of information sharing that bypassed established hierarchical channels. Raphael's sensitivity to spiritual and emotional health alerted him to changes in heaven's psychological climate. Angels, who had always displayed perfect contentment, were showing signs of restlessness, ambition, and dissatisfaction. The peace that had characterized angelic existence was being replaced by tension, excitement, and anticipation that seemed inappropriate for beings who had already achieved perfect fulfillment. These observations created concern among loyal archangels, but their attempts to address the situation were frustrated by the subtle nature of the changes and lack of explicit violations of divine commands. The recruited angels continued performing official duties competently, participating in heavenly worship, and maintaining outward expressions of loyalty to God. Their rebellion remained psychological and social rather than operational. The most troubling aspect was its impact on relationships that had existed harmoniously for eons. Angels who had been close colleagues and friends found themselves increasingly distant as fundamental orientations diverged. Conversations that had once been effortless became strained. Shared activities that had once brought joy became sources of tension. The unity that had been heaven's defining characteristic was dissolving into factionalism. Lucifer carefully managed this process to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk of premature exposure. He encouraged followers to maintain official responsibilities and outward loyalty while privately developing alternative vision and commitment to his leadership. This strategy allowed rebellion to grow in strength and numbers, while avoiding direct confrontation with divine authority until the movement was strong enough to survive such confrontation. The psychological impact on heaven's loyal inhabitants was devastating. Angels who had never experienced doubt, conflict, or division were forced to confront the reality that their perfect society was fracturing around them. They found themselves questioning not only the loyalty of colleagues, but also their own understanding of what was happening and why. God's continued silence during this period created additional complexity for all parties. Loyal angels wondered why their Creator was not intervening to address obvious problems developing in heaven. Rebellious angels interpreted this silence as confirmation that their activities were acceptable or even divinely endorsed. Both groups were forced to make decisions about unprecedented circumstances without clear divine guidance. Heaven was dividing into two camps, with incompatible visions of cosmic order and authority. The tension that had begun in Lucifer's private thoughts had become a system-wide crisis that would soon require resolution through direct confrontation. The gathering of the host was nearly complete, and the time for choosing sides was rapidly approaching. Heaven's carefully maintained facade of unity shattered on what should have been an ordinary day in the eternal realm. The breaking point came not through gradual escalation, but through a single divine announcement that crystallized every hidden tension and unexpressed grievance that had been building within Lucifer's growing coalition. God had decided to create a new order of beings called humans. The announcement arrived through normal administrative channels, with detailed instructions for angelic involvement in this creative project. These new creatures would inhabit a physical realm called Earth, possess bodies made from material elements, and be granted dominion over their world and its inhabitants. The specifications were unprecedented in their scope and implications. Humans would be created in God's own image, bearing divine characteristics, including intelligence, creativity, and moral agency. They would possess free will comparable to that of angels, but with even greater latitude for independent action and self-determination. Most remarkably, they would enjoy a form of fellowship with God that differed qualitatively from the service-based relationship that defined angelic existence. As Lucifer studied these plans, the implications became increasingly disturbing from his evolved perspective. These physically inferior beings would receive privileges that had never been extended to angels. They would be permitted to create, to explore, to make autonomous decisions about their destiny. They would experience God's love through invitation and fellowship, rather than through commands and service expectations. The announcement included another detail that proved to be the final catalyst. Should these humans choose rebellion against their Creator, provisions had already been made for their redemption and restoration. God's love for these future beings was so profound that he was prepared to sacrifice significantly to maintain relationship with them even after betrayal. This revelation exposed what Lucifer now perceived as a fundamental injustice in cosmic order. Angels, who had served faithfully since creation's beginning, were expected to find fulfillment in unchanging service roles. Yet, these untested, inferior beings would be granted freedoms, privileges, and redemptive possibilities that had never been offered to heaven's most faithful servants. The contrast seemed to demonstrate that God's love was not distributed according to merit, faithfulness, or capability, but according to arbitrary divine preference. The accumulated weight of perceived injustice, frustrated ambition, and philosophical disagreement reached a critical mass that demanded expression. Lucifer made the decision that would transform cosmic history. He would no longer conceal his opposition to divine arrangements, but would openly challenge what he now viewed as an unjust and irrational system of governance. The setting for this declaration was carefully chosen. During a general assembly of heaven's administrative councils, when representatives from all angelic orders were present to receive instructions regarding the human creation project, Lucifer rose to address the gathering. His position as chief administrator gave him the authority to speak, while the formal setting ensured that his words would be heard by the maximum number of angels and would carry the weight of official significance. His opening words were measured and seemingly respectful, framed as questions about the wisdom and justice of the announced divine plan. Why, he asked, were beings of inferior capability being granted superior privileges? How did the extensive freedom offered to humans reconcile with the strict limitations placed on angelic service? What theological principle justified offering redemption to future rebels while providing no similar provisions for beings who had served faithfully but might have questions about their assignments? These questions were designed to appear reasonable and legitimate, the kind of inquiries that any thoughtful administrator might raise when presented with policies that seemed inconsistent with established precedents. However, embedded within them were fundamental challenges to divine wisdom, justice, and authority that represented a complete departure from the submission and trust that had characterized angelic existence. As Lucifer continued speaking, his questions became more pointed and his challenges more explicit. He spoke of the exceptional capabilities that angels possessed, capabilities that were being constrained by narrow role definitions, while inferior beings were being granted broad autonomy. He questioned whether divine love was truly being expressed through arrangements that seemed to value service from some beings while offering fellowship to others. The climactic moment came when Lucifer directly challenged the justice of God's decision-making. He declared that the announced plan for humanity demonstrated either divine favoritism or divine inconsistency, both of which were incompatible with the perfect justice that God claimed to embody. He suggested that beings of superior capability and proven loyalty deserved consideration equal to or greater than that being offered to untested creatures of inferior nature. This declaration crossed every line that had previously defined the boundaries of acceptable angelic discourse. Never before had any created being openly questioned divine wisdom, challenged divine justice, or suggested that God's decisions required justification according to standards external to divine will itself. The immediate response to Lucifer's declaration was stunned silence, followed by chaos. Angels who had never experienced public disagreement about divine matters found themselves witnessing open rebellion against their Creator. The psychological shock was overwhelming for beings accustomed to perfect unity and unquestioned divine authority. Michael was the first to respond, his military training enabling him to process the unprecedented situation more quickly than others. He rose immediately to reject Lucifer's challenges and to affirm his complete confidence in divine wisdom and justice. His response was brief but definitive. God's ways were perfect by definition, and questioning divine decisions was itself evidence of corrupted judgment rather than legitimate concern. Gabriel followed with his own declaration of loyalty, emphasizing that divine love was demonstrated through the very gift of existence and purpose that all angels had received. He argued that comparing divine treatment of different orders of beings was inappropriate, since each was created for specific purposes that reflected divine wisdom beyond their ability to fully comprehend. However, these loyal responses were met by supporting voices for Lucifer's position. Beelzebub rose to endorse his leader's concerns, adding his own observations about the apparent inconsistencies in divine governance. Other recruited angels began to speak, each adding their perspectives to what was rapidly becoming a formal debate about the nature of divine authority and the rights of created beings. The assembly fractured along lines that had been developing secretly for an extended period, but were now being revealed publicly for the first time. Approximately 1/3 of the angelic host aligned themselves with Lucifer's position, while the remainder maintained their loyalty to God. The perfect unity that had defined heaven since its creation was irreparably shattered. The loyal angels found themselves facing a situation for which they had no preparation or precedent. Their colleagues, their leaders, their trusted companions were openly advocating rebellion against their Creator. The foundations of their reality, perfect divine authority, universal angelic submission, and eternal cosmic harmony, were crumbling before their eyes. The rebellious angels experienced their own form of shock as the private conversations and secret recruiting suddenly became public declaration and open commitment. There could be no retreat from the positions they had now taken, no return to the ambiguity that had characterized their earlier dissatisfaction. They had crossed the threshold from hidden dissent to public rebellion. Most significantly, God remained silent throughout this entire confrontation. The Creator, who was being openly challenged, whose wisdom was being questioned, whose authority was being rejected, offered no immediate response. This silence was interpreted differently by each faction. The loyal angels saw it as divine patience and dignity, while the rebellious angels interpreted it as divine acknowledgement that their concerns had merit. The catalyst had achieved its purpose. The hidden divisions in heaven were now open conflicts that could only be resolved through decisive action. The time for gradual development, subtle recruitment, and private rebellion had ended. Heaven was now divided into two camps with incompatible visions of cosmic order, and the conflict between them would determine the future structure of all creation. Heaven had never known military preparation in any conventional sense. Since its creation, the realm had existed in perfect peace, with conflict being not just absent, but literally inconceivable. The closest approximation to organized force was Michael's role as commander of the heavenly host, but this position had always been ceremonial and administrative rather than tactical. Now, for the first time in cosmic history, two armies were forming within the celestial realm itself. Michael faced the unprecedented task of organizing loyal angels into an actual fighting force. His military knowledge was theoretical rather than practical. He understood principles of warfare, strategy, and command structure from his divine endowment of wisdom, but had never applied these concepts in real combat situations. The loyal angels who looked to him for leadership were similarly unprepared, having existed since creation in a state of absolute peace and harmony. The practical challenges were immense. Heaven's architecture had been designed for worship, administration, and fellowship, not warfare. There were no armories, no defensive fortifications, no tactical positions that could be secured or defended. The very concept of creating weapons to be used against fellow angels was foreign and disturbing to beings who had known only cooperation and mutual service. Michael's forces did possess certain advantages that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. Their loyalty to God was absolute and unquestioned, providing them with moral certainty and spiritual strength that would sustain them through unprecedented trauma. They also maintained access to divine power through their continued submission to God's authority, while the rebellious angels were beginning to experience the first subtle effects of separation from their Creator. The loyal angels organized themselves according to their existing hierarchical structure, with archangels serving as field commanders and the various orders of angels forming distinct military units. Seraphim, with their proximity to God's throne and continuous worship, served as spiritual anchors for the entire force. Cherubim, as guardians of divine holiness, took on protective roles. The warrior angels who had served under Michael's ceremonial command now prepared to fulfill their military function for the first time. On the opposing side, Lucifer faced different but equally significant organizational challenges. His forces, while substantial in number, comprising approximately 1/3 of heaven's angelic population, were united primarily by shared dissatisfaction and loyalty to his charismatic leadership rather than by clear military doctrine or established chain of command. Many of his followers were intellectuals, administrators, and artists who had joined his rebellion for philosophical rather than military reasons. However, Lucifer's army possessed certain strategic advantages. They had been operating as a covert organization for an extended period, developing communication networks, identifying key personnel, and establishing informal command structures. They had also been psychologically preparing for conflict through their gradual alienation from divine authority, while the loyal angels were experiencing the shock of sudden transition from peace to warfare. Lucifer himself proved to be a formidable military leader despite his lack of combat experience. His exceptional intelligence allowed him to rapidly master principles of strategy and tactics. His intimate knowledge of heaven's geography and the capabilities of individual angels enabled him to develop sophisticated battle plans. Most importantly, his charismatic leadership inspired his followers with confidence in their cause and certainty of victory. The rebel army organized along different principles than their opponents. Rather than maintaining strict hierarchical structure, Lucifer encouraged innovation and independent thinking among his commanders. This approach reflected his core philosophy of expanded autonomy and created a more flexible, adaptive military organization. His forces were motivated not just by loyalty to their leader, but by genuine belief that they were fighting for a more just and rational cosmic order. The initial engagement between the two armies occurred not through physical combat, but through what can only be described as spiritual and intellectual warfare. Both sides understood that the conflict was fundamentally about ideas, authority, and the nature of cosmic order, rather than mere territorial control or resource acquisition. Lucifer opened this phase of the conflict by issuing a formal challenge to divine authority. Standing before the assembled hosts of heaven, with his supporters arrayed behind him and the loyal angels positioned in opposition, he delivered what amounted to a declaration of war against the existing cosmic order. His words were carefully crafted to appear reasonable and principled, rather than rebellious and destructive. He began by acknowledging God's role as creator and the source of all existence, but questioned whether creative authority automatically conferred perpetual governmental authority over rational beings capable of independent thought and moral reasoning. He argued that the divine system, while perhaps appropriate for the early stages of cosmic development, had become obsolete as created beings matured intellectually and spiritually. Lucifer's central argument focused on the concept of earned authority versus inherited authority. He contended that leadership should be based on demonstrated capability, wisdom, and commitment to justice, rather than on the accident of being first or most powerful. He presented his own qualifications for expanded authority: NEN, his exceptional gifts, his perfect service record, his intimate knowledge of divine purposes, and contrasted these with what he characterized as God's increasingly arbitrary and inconsistent governance. This intellectual challenge was designed to force the loyal angels to examine and justify their continued submission to divine authority. Lucifer was betting that rational examination of the existing system would reveal its flaws and inconsistencies, leading thoughtful angels to question their automatic loyalty and consider alternative arrangements. Michael's response was immediate and uncompromising. He rejected the premise that divine authority required justification according to standards external to itself. God's authority, he argued, was inherent in his nature as creator and was therefore absolute, eternal, and beyond the legitimate scope of created beings' evaluation. The very act of questioning divine authority was evidence of corrupted judgment and spiritual rebellion. The debate that followed was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Angels who had never disagreed about anything found themselves engaging in passionate arguments about fundamental questions of existence, authority, and justice. The perfect unity that had characterized heaven since its creation was shattered by philosophical divisions that seemed irreconcilable. As the verbal conflict escalated, both sides began to realize that resolution through discussion and debate was impossible. The differences between them were too fundamental, their basic assumptions about reality too incompatible for any compromise or negotiation to succeed. The conflict would have to be resolved through direct confrontation and the decisive victory of one side over the other. The transition from intellectual warfare to physical combat marked another unprecedented moment in cosmic history. Never before had perfect beings engaged in violence against each other. The very concept of angels fighting angels was so foreign to their nature that both sides had to overcome profound psychological barriers before actual combat could begin. The first physical engagement occurred when one of Lucifer's commanders, emboldened by their leader's rhetoric and frustrated by the loyal angels' refusal to acknowledge their arguments, made the decision to move from words to action. The specific trigger was a moment when Gabriel attempted to read a divine proclamation calling for the immediate cessation of rebellious activities and the return of all angels to their proper positions and duties. The rebel commander, whose identity is recorded in some historical accounts as Abaddon, physically prevented Gabriel from completing the proclamation by seizing the scroll containing God's words and casting it aside. This act of open violence against God's messenger transformed the conflict from a war of ideas into a literal battle for control of heaven itself. The combat that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in the universe. These were not mortal beings fighting with crude weapons and limited abilities, but immortal creatures of immense power engaging in warfare with capabilities that transcended physical laws. The battle raged across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with angels wielding forces that could reshape reality itself. The weapons employed were not material objects, but manifestations of spiritual power and divine authority. Loyal angels fought with swords of flame that represented the cutting edge of divine truth, shields of light that reflected God's protective power, and armor of righteousness that defended against spiritual corruption. The rebel angels countered with weapons of their own creation, after implements of darkness that drew their power from pride, rebellion, and the rejection of divine authority. The scope of the battle was cosmic in scale. Combat occurred simultaneously in heaven's central realms, its outer territories, and the boundary regions where the celestial realm intersected with the material universe. Entire sections of heaven's architecture were damaged or destroyed in the fighting, representing the first instance of imperfection and destruction in a realm that had previously known only beauty and harmony. The strategies employed reflected the fundamental philosophies of each side. Michael's forces fought with disciplined coordination, maintaining strict hierarchical command structure and relying on time-tested principles of divine order. They drew strength from their unity of purpose and their continued connection to God's power through absolute obedience and trust. Lucifer's army fought with innovation and adaptation, constantly developing new tactics and encouraging individual initiative among commanders. They drew strength from their conviction that they were fighting for a more just cosmic order and their belief that victory would validate their rebellion and establish their right to expanded authority and independence. The course of the battle was marked by dramatic reversals and shifting momentum. Initially, Lucifer's forces seemed to have the advantage due to their superior planning, motivation, and innovative tactics. They succeeded in capturing key strategic positions within heaven and appeared to be on the verge of forcing a decisive confrontation at the very throne of God. However, as the conflict continued, the fundamental reality of spiritual warfare began to assert itself. The loyal angels, despite their initial disadvantages in preparation and organization, possessed an unshakable source of strength in their continued connection to God. Their power was not diminished by the conflict, but seemed to grow stronger as they drew more deeply on divine resources through their unwavering faith and submission. The rebel angels, conversely, began to experience the spiritual consequences of their separation from God. Their power, which had always been derived from their Creator, began to weaken as their rebellion deepened. The further they moved from divine authority, the less access they had to the spiritual energy that sustained their existence and capabilities. The turning point came when it became clear that Lucifer's forces, despite their courage and determination, could not sustain their rebellion against the source of their own existence. The war in heaven was not a conflict between equals, but between creatures and their creator, a contest with a predetermined outcome, despite the genuine freedom of the participants to choose their sides. As the tide of battle turned decisively against the rebels, Lucifer faced the choice that would define the remainder of cosmic history. He could acknowledge defeat, repent of his rebellion, and seek reconciliation with God, or he could persist in his defiance, even unto complete separation from the source of life and goodness. His decision would not only determine his own fate, but establish the precedent for how rebellion against divine authority would be resolved throughout the universe. The silence that had characterized God's response throughout the entire rebellion finally came to an end. As the cosmic battle raged and heaven's perfect order lay in ruins, the Creator who had been challenged, questioned, and openly defied by his most beloved creation, chose to break his silence. But when God finally spoke, his words carried a weight and sorrow that penetrated the very foundations of existence. The voice that had spoken creation into being now addressed the rebellion that threatened to tear it apart. This was not the commanding voice that had established the laws of physics and set the stars in their courses, nor was it the gentle voice that had lovingly crafted each angel and assigned their perfect roles. This was the voice of a father whose heart was breaking as he watched his children destroy themselves and each other. God's words were not directed to the loyal angels, who had never wavered in their devotion and trust. They were not aimed at the terrified observers throughout creation who watched the cosmic conflict unfold. Instead, God spoke directly to Lucifer, the morning star, the light bearer, the one who had been closest to his heart and was now furthest from his will. Lucifer. The single word resonated through every dimension of heaven, carrying within it the entire history of their relationship. It was a name that had once been spoken with pride and joy, a name that represented the pinnacle of creative achievement, a name that now carried the weight of infinite disappointment and grief. The Creator's next words laid bare the tragic irony of the rebellion. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God, and you walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created. Each phrase was both an acknowledgement of what Lucifer had been and an indictment of what he had chosen to become. God was not speaking in anger, but in profound sorrow, cataloging the magnificence that was being destroyed by pride and rebellion. The divine voice continued, "But iniquity was found in you. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned." Here was the diagnosis of Lucifer's fall, delivered by the only being in existence qualified to make it. The rebellion had not been caused by external forces or circumstances, but by internal corruption. Lucifer's very gifts, his beauty, his wisdom, his splendor, had become the instruments of his destruction when he chose to view them as personal possessions rather than divine endowments. The silence that followed these words was more profound than any that had come before. Every angel, whether loyal or rebellious, waited to hear what judgment would be pronounced. Throughout creation, the very atoms seemed to hold their position as the universe awaited the divine verdict on the first and greatest rebellion. When God spoke again, his words carried the weight of eternal consequences. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroy you, O covering cherub. From the midst of the fiery stones, I cast you to the ground. The sentence had been pronounced, but there was no satisfaction in the divine voice, no triumph in the administration of justice. This was a father's necessity, not a judge's vengeance. The Creator was forced by His own perfect nature to separate Himself from rebellion, to remove corruption from perfection, to cast out those who had chosen to reject their source of life and goodness. Lucifer's response to this divine judgment revealed the complete transformation that had occurred within him. Rather than repentance, rather than acknowledgement of his error, rather than appeal for mercy, he met God's sentence with defiance. Standing amid his defeated forces, his beauty already beginning to fade, as separation from God took its toll, Lucifer made his final declaration of independence. "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," he declared, speaking words that would echo through history as the ultimate expression of prideful rebellion. In that moment, he chose eternal separation from God, rather than submission to divine authority. Even though that choice meant embracing destruction rather than accepting restoration. This response sealed not only Lucifer's fate, but also the fate of all who had followed him. The angels who had joined his rebellion now faced the same choice: repentance and restoration, or continued defiance and separation. The historical records indicate that some lower-ranking angels who had been swept up in the movement chose repentance and were restored to their positions. But the core leadership of the rebellion, those who had been most instrumental in its planning and execution, chose to follow their leader into exile. God's final words to Lucifer contained both judgment and prophecy. The immediate judgment was banishment from heaven and separation from divine presence. The prophetic element looked forward to ultimate consequences that would unfold across cosmic history. The rebellion that had begun in heaven would continue in other realms, affecting other beings, but its ultimate outcome was already determined. The Creator's voice carried one last note of infinite sadness, as he spoke words that applied not just to Lucifer, but to all who would choose rebellion over relationship. "You have brought yourself to nothing, and you shall be no more forever." Yet even in this final judgment, God's character remained unchanged. The same love that had created Lucifer remained intact, but love itself demanded that rebellion be separated from perfection, that corruption be removed from purity, that those who chose independence from their source of life be permitted to experience the logical consequences of that choice. The silence of God was broken, the judgment pronounced, and the sentence executed. What had begun as questions about divine arrangements had culminated in cosmic separation. The morning star had fallen, taking with him 1/3 of heaven's host, and creation itself would never be the same again. But even as judgment fell and separation occurred, the foundations for redemption were already being laid. The same divine love that had been forced to cast out rebellion would eventually provide a means for restoration, though at a cost that only God Himself could pay. The moment of banishment arrived with the finality of cosmic law. God's judgment, once pronounced, could not be delayed, modified, or reversed. The angels who had chosen rebellion over submission now faced the immediate consequences of their decision. What followed was not merely relocation from one realm to another, but fundamental transformation of their very nature and existence. The descent began as Lucifer and his followers were expelled from the holy mountain of God. This was not a gradual departure or negotiated withdrawal, but an instantaneous casting out that separated them from the source of their power, beauty, and life itself. The very foundations of heaven seemed to recoil from their presence as they were forcibly removed from the realm of perfect light and harmony. The physical mechanics of the fall defied normal understanding of space and dimension. These beings were not simply moving from one location to another within the same reality, but were being expelled from the highest realm of existence to the lowest. They fell through layers of creation, through spiritual dimensions that had been established to separate the sacred from the profane, the holy from the corrupt. As they descended, the rebellious angels began experiencing transformations that reflected their internal spiritual condition. Lucifer, who had been the most beautiful of all created beings, felt his radiance begin to dim and fade. The light that had made him the morning star was being extinguished, replaced by something darker and more sinister. His wings, once described as covering the very throne of God, began to change in both appearance and function. The precious stones that had been part of his essential nature, the sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, 200, lost their brilliance and beauty. What had once reflected divine glory now became symbols of fallen majesty, reminders of what had been lost through pride and rebellion. The gold workmanship that had been prepared within him became tarnished and corrupted. But the physical changes were only external manifestations of deeper spiritual transformation. Lucifer's wisdom, which had once comprehended divine mysteries and cosmic principles, became distorted and corrupted. His knowledge remained vast, but it was no longer illuminated by divine truth. Instead, it became the foundation for deception, manipulation, and destruction. His followers experienced similar transformations, each according to their individual nature and the degree of their participation in the rebellion. Angels who had been beings of light became creatures of darkness. Those who had been messengers of truth became purveyors of deception. Beings created for worship and service became instruments of temptation and corruption. The psychological impact of this transformation was as devastating as the physical changes. These angels had existed since creation in perfect harmony with their nature and purpose. They had known only success, fulfillment, and the joy of perfect service. Now they experienced failure, emptiness, and the bitter consequences of their choices for the first time. As the fall continued, Lucifer, who would henceforth be known by other names reflecting his new nature and role, began to understand the full scope of what he had lost. The position he had held as chief among all created beings was gone forever. The access to divine presence that had been his greatest privilege was permanently severed. The purpose for which he had been created could never again be fulfilled. Yet even in the depths of this realization, pride prevented repentance. Rather than acknowledging his error and crying out for mercy, Lucifer embraced his transformation and began to see it as the price of freedom. If he could not rule in heaven, he would create his own kingdom. If he could not reflect divine glory, he would generate his own power. If he could not serve God, he would oppose him. The destination of the fall was a realm that had been prepared for this very purpose, a place of separation from God, of darkness instead of light, of corruption instead of purity. This realm, which would come to be known as hell, was not created as a place of arbitrary punishment, but as the natural environment for beings who had chosen separation from their source of life and goodness. Hell was, in essence, the logical conclusion of rebellion against God. It was a realm where the consequences of pride, independence, and rejection of divine authority could be fully experienced. It was separation made complete, darkness made absolute, corruption made perfect in its own twisted way. As Lucifer and his followers took possession of this new realm, the transformation of their identities was completed. Lucifer became Satan, the adversary, the accuser, the opponent of everything divine. His name, which had once meant light-bearer, became associated with the Prince of Darkness. Beelzebub and the other high-ranking rebels similarly received new identities that reflected their fallen nature and corrupted purposes. The establishment of hell as Satan's kingdom represented a tragic parody of the divine order they had rejected. Where heaven operated through perfect submission to God's will, hell operated through rebellion against that will. Where heaven was characterized by harmony and cooperation, hell was marked by conflict and competition. Where heaven existed to glorify God, hell existed to oppose him. Yet even in their fallen state, these beings retained significant power and capability. Their rebellion had not destroyed their angelic nature, but had corrupted it. They remained immortal beings of great intelligence and supernatural ability, but these qualities were now dedicated to destructive rather than constructive purposes. Satan, in particular, retained enough of his original magnificence to deceive and tempt other beings, though his beauty was now false and his wisdom perverted. The completion of the fall marked the end of heaven's innocence and the beginning of cosmic warfare that would span all of creation. The rebellion that had begun with questions about divine arrangements had become an eternal conflict between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between truth and deception, between love and hatred. Satan's final transformation was not just personal, but purposeful. He had not simply become a fallen angel, but had appointed himself as the eternal enemy of God and everything God represented. His new mission was not to create alternative good, but to corrupt, destroy, and oppose the divine plan wherever possible. The fall was complete. The morning star had become the prince of darkness. The light bearer had become the father of lies. The most beautiful of all created beings had become the most hideous. And the cosmic war that began in heaven would now extend to every corner of creation, affecting every being that would ever exist. Yet even in this ultimate tragedy, the foundations for eventual redemption were being laid, though at a cost that only infinite love could pay. The silence that followed Satan's banishment was unlike any that heaven had previously known. This was not the peaceful quiet of perfect harmony, but the stunned stillness of a realm trying to process unprecedented trauma. For the first time in cosmic history, heaven had experienced violence, deception, betrayal, and loss. The perfect society that had existed since creation's beginning had been fundamentally altered by events that none of its inhabitants could have imagined possible. The loyal angels who remained faced the enormous task of rebuilding both their realm and their understanding of reality. Physical damage to heaven's architecture could be repaired, but the psychological and spiritual wounds ran much deeper. Angels who had never known doubt now struggled with questions about the nature of free will and its consequences. Those who had never experienced loss grieved for friends and colleagues who had chosen rebellion and exile. Michael emerged from the conflict as the undisputed military leader of heaven, but his new role carried responsibilities he had never anticipated. The ceremonial nature of his previous position as commander had been replaced by the harsh reality of actual warfare and its aftermath. He now had to organize ongoing defense against an enemy who retained significant power and had declared eternal opposition to God's kingdom. The Archangel's first priority was securing heaven against potential future attacks. Hell's proximity to the material universe meant that Satan and his forces remained active and dangerous. New protocols had to be established, new defensive measures implemented, and constant vigilance maintained. The age of innocence was over. The age of spiritual warfare had begun. Gabriel's role as God's messenger took on new dimensions as well. No longer was he simply carrying divine communications within a unified realm. Now, his duties included missions to the material universe, warnings about demonic activity, and complex interactions with beings who faced the same choice between obedience and rebellion that had divided heaven itself. Raphael found his healing ministry overwhelmed by the unprecedented spiritual and emotional wounds left by the rebellion. Angels who had never experienced trauma now needed restoration and comfort. The perfect psychological health that had characterized heavenly existence had been shattered, requiring new forms of divine grace and healing. The reorganization of heaven's government reflected these new realities. Positions vacated by fallen angels had to be filled, but not simply with promotions from within existing ranks. New qualifications became important, not just capability and wisdom, but proven loyalty and resistance to the temptations of pride and independence that had corrupted so many gifted beings. Meanwhile, in the depths of hell, Satan began establishing the dark kingdom that would serve as the base for his eternal opposition to God. The realm itself reflected the nature of its ruler and inhabitants, Wai'ais, a place where beauty was twisted into hideousness, where order was perverted into chaos, and where the creative impulse was channeled into destruction. Satan's first priority was organizing his fallen angels into an effective force for cosmic warfare. The beings who had followed him retained their angelic nature, though corrupted, and possessed significant supernatural abilities. Under his leadership, they became demons, A.G. said, spiritual entities dedicated to opposing God's purposes and corrupting his creation wherever possible. The hierarchy of hell emerged as a twisted reflection of heaven's order. Satan ruled as an absolute dictator rather than serving under divine authority. His subordinates competed for favor and position rather than cooperating in humble service. The very concept of selfless love was replaced by manipulation, exploitation, and the ruthless pursuit of power. Beelzebub, Satan's first recruit and most trusted lieutenant, became the chief administrator of hell's operations. Other high-ranking fallen angels received new names and roles that reflected their corrupted nature. What had once been a rebellion, motivated by philosophical concerns about divine justice, now became a systematic campaign of hatred and revenge against their former creator. The demons' activities were not limited to their infernal realm. With access to the material universe, they began infiltrating creation at every level, seeking opportunities to corrupt, deceive, and destroy. Every act of evil, every moment of suffering, every departure from divine will became a victory in their ongoing war against heaven. Satan himself retained much of his original magnificence, though completely corrupted. His intelligence, charisma, and understanding of divine purposes made him a formidable opponent. He could still appear as an angel of light when it served his purposes, using his remaining beauty to deceive and tempt. But beneath the attractive exterior lay infinite hatred for God and everything God represented. The fall of Lucifer was not an isolated incident, but the opening chapter in a cosmic drama that would span all of history. The rebellion that began in heaven now extended to every corner of creation, affecting every intelligent being that would ever exist. The fundamental choice between submission to God and assertion of independence would be offered to countless creatures across time and space. The creation of humanity, which had been announced just before Lucifer's open rebellion, proceeded according to divine plan, despite the cosmic upheaval. But now these new beings would be born into a universe where the choice between good and evil was not theoretical, but urgent and immediate. They would face the same temptations that had corrupted the angels, presented by the same enemy who had once been heaven's greatest servant. The entire material universe became a battlefield in the spiritual war that had begun in heaven. Every human decision, every moral choice, every act of faith or rebellion would be part of the larger conflict between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness. The stakes could not be higher. The eternal destiny of every soul would depend on which side they chose in this cosmic struggle. Yet even in the midst of this universal conflict, hope remained. The same divine love that had been forced to cast out rebellion would eventually provide a means for redemption. The Creator who had wept over Lucifer's fall was already preparing a plan that would offer restoration to all who chose it, though the cost would be beyond anything that finite minds could comprehend. The rebellion that had shattered heaven's peace would ultimately serve divine purposes, demonstrating the reality of free will, the consequences of pride, and the infinite value that God placed on voluntary love and service. What Satan intended for evil, God would transform into the greatest demonstration of divine love in cosmic history. The morning star had fallen, but another light was already being prepared, a light that would shine in the darkness and offer hope to all who had been affected by the ancient rebellion that began in the highest realms of heaven and would finally be resolved through the greatest sacrifice ever made. The God who wept over Lucifer's rebellion, who was forced by his own perfect nature to cast out corruption from paradise, didn't abandon his creation to the consequences of that cosmic war. The same divine love that had created the morning star would eventually descend into the very battlefield that Satan had made of our world. The light that Lucifer had carried and then rejected would shine again, not through a created being who could choose pride over service, but through the Creator himself. The price of redemption would be paid not by those who owed the debt, but by the one who was owed everything. Lucifer's rebellion had asked the question, "Why should I serve when I could rule?" The answer came not in words, but in the ultimate act of service. God himself taking the form of a servant, entering his own creation, and offering his life to repair what rebellion had broken. The morning star fell, but the sun of righteousness rose. The light-bearer became the prince of darkness, But the light of the world entered our darkness to offer hope to everyone touched by that ancient fall. This is why Lucifer's story matters. Not because it explains the origin of evil, SI, though it does. Not because it reveals the cosmic forces at work behind human history, though it does that too. It matters because it shows us that no rebellion is too great for divine love to overcome, no fall too far for grace to reach, and no darkness too deep for light to penetrate. The war that began in heaven continues around us and within us every day. But we know how it ends. Love wins. Light conquers darkness. And the God who refused to force Lucifer's loyalty will never stop offering ours. Freely given, freely chosen, and freely redeemed. The morning star fell, but for all who choose differently, there's another morning coming, and this time, the light will never fade. If you like more stories like this, hit that subscribe button and see you in the next video.